Okay, go ahead, Nadine. Thank you.
If someone can just give me a thumbs up if the presentation is sharing okay. Very good. Okay, so I'm going to start with this. So this is what tends to come up for people. The more that they learn about climate change, face up to the reality of the crisis, the more that people also suffer from the impacts. Feelings like these will be coming up. And people often talk about climate anxiety, eco-anxiety. Anxiety is just one. There's many other emotions: sadness, shame, anger. And all of these are powerful emotions that can be very difficult to experience. There might also be other emotions, what we tend to think of as positive emotions: excitement, hopefulness. And I'm going to just ask now to do the Mentimeter, where we will be asking you a question. So are you putting that into the chat?
Yes, so please everyone just click on this link and then you should see the question and also the different options that you can choose, and we would ask you to choose only one of these.
Yeah.
And,
yeah, so this is really just whatever it is that you're feeling right now in this moment, whatever emotion is kind of, most salient for you.
And Nadine, I will just stop your screen share for a moment so that I can also show what everyone is. Okay. So here we should see, yeah, what everyone is posting. Okay. And it is also anonymous, so you can be as honest as possible.
So I can't read the emotions. The print is a little bit too small, but anyway, what we can see is that there's variation basically across all the different emotions that we listed there. So I will just go back to sharing my slides, if that's okay.
If you just don't mind, I have my big screen in front of me, so I actually see what. So those that are the most chosen are compassion, worry, and anger, and then afterwards it's helplessness, hopeful, and sadness. And then yeah, there's also despair, upset, fear, anxiety. Yeah, so those are the ones.
Sure. Yeah. So okay, so let me share my screen again then. Okay, so what this is showing us, and what came back from you, is that we feel a mix of emotions, and actually, probably at some point we'll be feeling, one or more of these, sometimes simultaneously, including some which might feel in conflict with each other. So to some extent, it's not really which emotions in particular you feel, but because, as I say, we will be kind of probably experiencing all of these, but how we deal with these emotions and how we negotiate the tensions and inner conflicts that we might feel around that. Because it's how we deal with that and how that shapes our response, both to the crisis itself, but also influences whether the responses that we make are adaptive or maladaptive, personally and ecologically. So I want to go just a little bit more into what we know about what's happening with people. So here's our, on this slide, I'm not expecting you to actually look at, to be able to read the text, but YouGov have been doing this European tracker for a while, across 7 countries, Britain, France, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Spain and Italy. The results are on their website, you can find it there. So this is results from April of this year. It's the most recent ones that they've done, and they've also got showing the results for September. So just focusing on worry, the question about whether people are fairly or very worried about climate change and its effects. So across the countries, it varies from between 65% to 84%. That was September last year, and this year from 59% to 83%. So, you know, it's still the majority of the population that are reporting that this is how they are feeling based on this survey, which is with a fairly decent sample size. And then there was a survey that we did in Scotland last summer, that in a project I was involved with. And for that, we found that 2/3 of adults reported feeling worried, half felt overwhelmed, and a quarter that their feelings about climate change were having a negative impact on their mental health. You might already be familiar with the global study that was done also last year with 10,000 young people. So that's between 16 and 25. That was involved some colleagues from Climate Psychology Alliance. That was across 10 countries: Australia, Brazil, Finland, France, India, Nigeria, Philippines, Portugal, the UK and the USA. And with that study, so 59% of respondents reported feeling very or extremely worried. Almost half, over 45%, said their feelings were negatively affecting their daily lives. So these are just recent, you know, fairly major population surveys. We can see that this is, you know, not just affecting people in Europe, but also globally. And with that study in particular, it was young people. So one of the key messages from this is that if you are feeling worried or anxious or sad or angry, then you are far from being alone. In fact, the majority of the population is feeling similarly. But, you know, we don't really necessarily talk about it or feel like we can talk about it with others. So most people don't know that actually most other people are feeling like they're feeling. So that sense of being aloneness can exacerbate the difficulty of experiencing, you know, strong emotions like this. The other so that's one key point that we tend to talk about when we do these kind of presentations in climate psychology. The other point is that feelings of worry and sadness and so on can be understood as being appropriate responses given the severity of the climate and ecological crisis that we face. But as I say, it's how people can regulate these difficult emotions in a way that's healthy and that promotes positive action, rather than, you know, where it becomes a mental health issue. That is really the point, not really whether you're experiencing emotions or not. So I just want to step back a little bit for a moment and just look at position climate change and mental health and well-being, you know, in the kind of broader context here. So this is now much better understood. There's way more studies on it. There's a lot more attention on it in recent years. And the relationship between climate change and human health and well-being goes in both directions. So the impacts of climate change, you know, affect our health and well-being, but our state of health and well-being also affects our ability to respond to and to cope with the impacts of climate change. And just sort of bringing a climate justice lens to this. Well, there are some groups, you know, obviously that are more vulnerable to the mental health impacts of climate change than others, for a whole variety of factors, whether these groups are, you know, demographic, whether it's to do with geography, to do with other factors. There's also inequalities in access to support and services, and inequalities in the provision of these support and services. I want to just look in a little bit on a particular example now. So we know that there's global evidence that natural disasters can cause stress, post-traumatic stress, anxiety, depression, also suicidality. And there's some research that was done with an event in Scotland back in the winter of 2015-16. I'm based in Scotland, so that's why I'm showing this example. So there were severe floods in the northeast of Scotland in this period. And research, so this was one piece of research was a 3-year study, so that found a high degree of variation in how people were affected by the flooding and its aftermath, and in how they coped and how they recovered. So there was a lot of variation in that. They found both short and longer term impacts on health and well-being for some people. For some people, the strongest impact was in the months immediately after the flooding. For others, it was on returning home after being in temporary accommodation. But they found that groups that were more vulnerable to the long-term negative impacts were children, older people, especially the frail, elderly, those that were living alone, and those that had pre-existing stressful life events or medical conditions. And there was another study with the same community on the same flood. And that found that the flood and its aftermath had increased stress levels for many people, affecting their home life, their personal relationships in particular, with symptoms including anxiety, tiredness, sleeplessness, feeling low and feeling overwhelmed. And what was interesting and possibly, alarming was that most survey respondents didn't seek help for the way that they were feeling. Some reported using a variety of stress management activities, most commonly friends, family support. But reasons given for not seeking help included embarrassment, a view that they just had to get on with it, or a belief that the problems would ease once their house was sorted, which wasn't always the case. Most of the survey respondents that were negatively affected by the flood had pre-existing mental well-being problems. So it's likely that these problems were exacerbated by their flood experience. Okay, so I'm going to have a look now at what is going on when people are suffering from stress. So stress and anxiety arise when our nervous system perceives a threat, and climate change poses profound threat in a variety of ways to us. So, there's the existential threat to people's lives, or also that's already happening, obviously, and will continue to get worse. But it poses threat in other ways, more psychological ways, who we think we are as individuals and as a society, our sense of worthiness. It threatens our ideas about the future, what kind of lives we thought we were going to have on our children's lives. So when the nervous system perceives threat, it dysregulates the nervous system, and that creates stress. And there's a human tendency then to want to alleviate stress and decrease these sorts of emotions through defenses and coping strategies. And this is just what the body does. It's what we do. It's a kind of normal part of human functioning. And it does that in order to get the body and the mind back to sort of baseline functioning as soon as possible. And that's because prolonged stress affects cognitive functioning and can create major health problems, involving exhaustion and illness, and ultimately leading to death. So the body, wants to try and return to baseline function as soon as possible if it can through these defenses and coping strategies. But these strategies have outcomes that can be adaptive or maladaptive on a personal level and also ecologically. So they can bring positive or negative benefits in short term, longer term. And then there's a whole lot of contextual factors and forces that influence the way that we might perceive threat, how stressed we feel, what defenses and coping strategies we use. And there's a whole load of different factors that might affect how effective the coping strategies actually are. So it's a complex thing, and most of these processes are playing out below the level of our conscious awareness. So we can also think about this in terms of the kind of climate justice perspective, that there's to think about whether there's societal and health inequalities that might be affecting how this plays out for some groups. So let's just look now at maladaptive defenses and coping. So I'm not going to go through this in detail, but this is something which I kind of compiled from the literature for my PhD a few years ago. So maladaptive defenses and coping are things which we do which really inhibit in the longer term our ability to deal with the reality of the situation, and that inhibit appropriate and proportional actions. And all defenses and coping strategies have got emotional and cognitive and behavioral dimensions. So you can see on this slide here that there's a range of different ways that we might want to categorize these, and the ones that we're particularly sort of looking at today in this session is around avoiding thinking or feeling, with this focus on climate anxiety and climate emotions. But across all of these strategies, why would we do them if they're maladaptive? And well, it's because they bring benefits. They defend us from having to feel, which protects us from having to take responsibility, having to take significant action. They might be serving to enhance our self-esteem if that's somehow been threatened by climate change in some way. So that would be ones around the self-enhancement there. Protects our sense of self, and the diversionary activities, they help to kind of mollify guilt and are a form of, they help to defend against feelings of helplessness and hopelessness. Reasserts a sense of being in control because, we're doing something. Adaptive coping strategies, well, these ones are ones which do help us to adjust to the reality of the situation and do help to stimulate appropriate and proportional actions. So here, focusing on emotion regulation. So this is where we're engaging with and working through these difficult emotions in a healthy way. But because, grief and anxiety and so on are really difficult emotions to experience, that is why it is a really common defense to avoid feeling these emotions through suppression or other strategies. And in my PhD research, I found that even people with strong pro-environmental values, which might be many of us or all of us in this session now, have a tendency to want to suppress difficult emotions about the climate and ecological crisis out of fear, largely, that we'll get stuck in them and be unable to function. So that was what I was finding in my research. You'll notice I'm referring to things as difficult emotions, not negative emotions. That's because, well, all emotions have a purpose. So that's why I don't like to refer to some of them as negative. They're cues. They direct our attention, they guide behavior, they're integral to decision making and our ability to retain and act on information. They perform a vital function. They're not a sort of evolutionary mistake. So we need to pay attention to whatever it is that's arising for us. But the key question is about how we engage with and work through these difficult emotions. So that, they don't get stuck in the body and in the mind, and we're able to kind of get through it to some sort of resolution, so that we don't get into dysregulation and end up becoming ill from it. So here's just a slide that I've done to sort of try to describe this in a way. So if you think about this kind of the low end of engagement with emotions, where we're detached from what's going on, there's a lot of suppression, avoidance going on, maybe completely dissociated, and then at the high end, this is where we're kind of completely overwhelmed and consumed by the emotion. that's not great either. And actually going very far into that direction can send us into that kind of very sort of dissociation state as well. So I do want to say that in some situations, of course, it might be appropriate to suppress emotions, you know, where it's just not safe, it doesn't feel safe to express them. The problem is if this is a strategy that's used all the time, okay? Because suppressed emotions don't go away. Suppression takes effort, so it's psychologically and physically tiring. It also diverts cognitive resources away from other tasks. It's when the body is in a threat response, then it's also diverting glucose and oxygen away from parts of the brain that are involved in more sophisticated thinking. But there is a whole load of evidence about the negative health consequences associated with suppression of strong emotion over the longer term. So this middle space, this middle bit in the graph is where we are giving space to whatever it is that we're experiencing. We're allowing ourselves to feel it, but with a bit of mindful detachment. So a metaphor that I like to use here, that I use when I teach mindfulness a lot, is a fire. So thinking of the fire as your emotion. So you don't want to be in the fire getting burnt, but equally you don't want to be so far away that you can't even feel it. So you're close enough to feel the warmth of the fire. You're in touch with what's going on with you, but you know, with that little bit of detachment there. And in this space, we're finding ways to express it. You know, it could be through talking, but it could also be through doing writing and other creative artistic work, prayer, ritual, other spiritual and religious practices, movement practices like Qigong, Tai Chi, yoga, which help to move some of the energy through the body. So what's happening in this space here is that rather than sort of driving us from behind into maladaptive responses, these difficult emotions are being brought into conscious awareness, where we can then work with them and, you know, use them creatively even. And I'm going to just show you this slide, but not talk too much about it, just because of time. But it's a model which I really like, the window of tolerance. Maybe you're already familiar with it. Dan Siegel's model. There's a whole load of resources around this on the internet, but it's really sort of showing how our nervous system in a threat response can be pushed out into hyperarousal, which is the kind of the fight flight response, or into the hypoarousal as a freeze response. And you know, so in those states of a threat response of high stress, you know, we want to be able to get out of those dysregulated states and back into a state where the parasympathetic nervous system is in charge, and we can think more clearly and more calmly and make more wiser decisions, hopefully. But you can see, you know, the nervous system is always fluctuating, but within sort of parameters. So it's when it comes outside of those parameters that we're being pushed into these other states. So in terms of what we're experiencing when we're in stress, there's a whole load of different symptoms. And so it helps to develop sensitivity to noticing early signs of stress. So detecting the weak signals, so that you can act before it becomes a major problem. So if you think of, you know, where are you on the scale right now between -10 and +10? So +10 is, you know, it's impossible to feel any better. -10 would be a very bad place. You know, 0, you're just about clinging on. So you might want to just reflect for yourself, where are you right now on this scale? So if you're kind of mostly somewhere at a 6, let's say, or a 7, you might want to catch yourself when you're heading to 3 or 4 and notice that, and then do something to try and enhance it, rather than waiting until it's a 0 or below 0, when it's just so obvious that you've actually become ill, or you're getting burnt out. So this is where a lot of mindfulness practices come in, to help us become more attuned to noticing what's going on with us internally. And there's various different signs of stress that are associated with that hyperarousal state, and also the hypoarousal state. And all of this, as I say, affects cognitive functioning, because of just what's happening in the body physiologically when the body's in a threat response. So I'm going to move, this is the final slide now. And this is about a few tips, around managing difficult emotions. So firstly, just knowing that it's normal and it's common to feel worried. And for me, being a researcher, I like data, I like evidence. So, I find it very interesting that most people that studies indicate anyway, are actually feeling like this. The other thing is that feeling worried and angry and so on is a sign that you're connected, and that's a good thing. You're connected to what's going on. But to be doing these kind of check-ins with yourself, so how are you feeling right now? Thinking about that scale, where are you on that scale? Also just understanding a bit about how the nervous system works in terms of, how it detects threat and safety, neuroception, as it's referred to. Personally, I find that very helpful. It kind of takes some of the, if it's just something that your nervous system is doing, you're not always in control of it. And that can help if people are feeling very sort of self-critical about how they're responding. And then noticing these early signs of stress, becoming familiar with what your stressors are and your coping responses, and are these coping responses adaptive for you personally and also ecologically in the longer term? Are you, is there a lot of avoidance going on? Regularly, taking a breathing space, doing mindfulness and movement exercises, which help to calm the nervous system, release tension, and also over the longer term help to build psychological resilience. Finding ways to express how you feel, which could be through climate cafes, which we'll be doing shortly. The taking the meaningful action, not this diversionary action. But with that, keeping a sense of perspective around all of this. It's not all, there's a limit to what any of us can do individually and with others. The responsibility doesn't fall on, just your shoulders. At the same time, that isn't, you've got to be careful with that one as well, that you don't fall into what that coping strategy of then kind of, somehow shifting the blame elsewhere or the responsibility elsewhere. And how we look out for each other. So really, as it kind of showed in the Mentimeter, it's important to acknowledge that there are conflicts and tensions within us, and that we're all experiencing conflicting emotions when it comes to climate change and ecological crisis, and that all of us, to some extent, at some time, are in a form of denial, because it is scary. So nobody's doing this perfectly. Nobody's completely right, and nobody's completely wrong in the way that we're responding. And when we kind of realize that, it can help to bring a kind of sense of humility, which helps to relate to one another with compassion and forgiveness. And I noticed that some people have put compassion there, which is good. So final points around creating a sense of safety for yourself and for others, in this way where we to create and hold spaces for reflection and for emotions, and that's what you'll be experiencing shortly with the Climate Cafe and the way that that's facilitated, which Rebecca will explain. And again, here, I suppose from a climate justice perspective, we could be thinking about, inequalities in access to such spaces, access to facilitation training, in creating and holding such spaces. I don't mean just climate cafes, I mean, more broadly than that. And the other thing that occurred to me to say was about that, how some groups, when they express particular emotions, how that might be perceived by the dominant culture differently than if another group was expressing that same emotion, due to racism, sexism, whatever. So, sometimes often, people might be perceived as being more aggressive, particularly Black people, leading to harsher treatment. So yeah, I'm sure there's a lot more that we could think about in terms of what are the climate justice perspectives to this, but these are just some initial thoughts, really. So how am I doing for time, first of all?
Good, actually. So we have, around 7 minutes, or let's say 10 minutes for questions.
Perfect. So, well, I'm going to do a little mindfulness exercise now.
I will just stop the recording. Sorry, I will just do that first, and then